Hello, listeners. Welcome to the 122nd episode of the Supporting Child Caregivers Podcast. I'm Alexandra Harrison. The Supporting Child Caregivers Podcast is a source of helpful information for parents, health workers, teachers, and other child caregivers across the globe. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Hendren. Dr. Hendren is Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and member of a number of important boards, including the Autism Research Institute and the Oak Hill School for Children with Autism. Now, Dr. Hendren only just recently retired, and he's been very active at UCSF and in many other research activities. So he's really up to date on many important subjects that we will want to talk to him about today. He's very interested in translational interventional outcomes research, which includes clinical pharmacology, nutraceutical and nutritional trials using biomarkers such as metabolomics, measures of inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune function, pharmacogenomics, and neuroimaging to enhance resiliency in neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm so pleased to talk to you today, Bob, because, well, you know that I've invited you to speak many times before, and I'm particularly interested to share with our listeners some of your ideas that I have found most congenial and helpful, such as your idea of terroir and neurodevelopmental disorders, and some of your knowledge about this really fascinating field of translational interventional outcomes research, including some of those new terms to many of us. So maybe you could begin by telling us about your concept of terroir.
Well, thanks for having me, Dr. Harrison. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to share ideas with you again. I always have enjoyed that in many different settings. And I look forward to talking a bit about just the concepts that I've used to guide my research and to guide my clinical care, and in that way being translational in the way that we think. We started off thinking of autism, many years ago as a group of symptoms. We looked at kind of the surface, if you will, of what we saw in people's symptoms and would put them together in a DSM diagnosis. And we didn't get much beneath the surface. We only saw the symptoms. And then we started saying, gee, this is really a complex disorder, because some kids that look like they have autism have all of these symptoms or only some of these symptoms, or some don't have all of them. So we found that it changed over time. And that was true not just for autism, but for other disorders as well, but it seemed especially so for autism. So we said, boy, this surface of the earth, this looking at the outside, is not really going to help us understand this disorder and how we're going to treat it. So then genetics was becoming increasingly popular, and everybody said, wow, we'll find the gene for autism. That'll help us know what causes autism and how we could do some kind of genetic engineering or do something with the genes that would then help us treat autism better or classify it better or understand it better because we knew the genes. But as we got into genes more and more, we found there were many genes that were different for different people. They weren't the same for everybody. We couldn't put 10 genes together and say that's autism, because some people had those 10, but some people had one or two of those plus another number. And most studies have said that there are at least 100 and maybe more genes that are variably associated with autism. So we said, it's not really genes that's going to help us do this either. And then more recently, we started appreciating the way genes express themselves, what happens between if we talk about genetics and that's the core of the earth, and symptoms, and that's the surface of the earth, the action is really what's happening in between. How do genes express themselves? How do they go through some of the processes you mentioned, like oxidative stress or inflammatory kinds of processes or other things that then affect how genes express themselves? Not everybody that has that gene would have that happen if they didn't have this kind of outside process affecting it. So I have just a little more of the story to get to Terroir, and then we'll kind of drill down on it. But
no, it's fascinating what you're telling me. I really appreciate it. So continue with the story, and then we'll get to the terroir.
So, as you know, my wife is French, and she has a place in Paris, and both of our kids were raised being bilingual, and both are really fluent. Our youngest daughter got her undergraduate degree and her PhD in Paris, and while she was there, met a young man who was from the Alsatian region of France, and they are married now and happily doing well. But at that time, he said, "Why don't you come and meet my parents?" So we went to Alsace, and parents said, "We have a lot of great wines in Alsace, Alsatian wines. You want to visit some wineries?" I said, "Yeah, that sounds great." And each winery that we went to, people talked about their terroir. They talked about how a glacier came down through Alsace-Lorraine and carved out the soil, so that the soil had a mixture of things like clay and sand and ash and other things that were there. And they said it's the terroir that makes our wine so special, that gives it this, the grapes, the cepage, gives it this special kind of taste. And I thought, that's the way kids grow brains. They have this kind of mixture of these things that come together in these different layers. And sometimes it grows good neurons, and sometimes it doesn't, just as growing the cepage or the grapes would be affected by it. So it led me to think more about what I have identified as 8 or 9 different processes that we've mentioned already, like oxidative stress and inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction and a variety of other things that are affecting the layers and how the brain is growing. It's not only those things, as one of my colleagues, Sally Rogers, who developed the Early Start Denver model and does a lot with behavioral programs. And when I was presenting this model the first time when I was at the Mind Institute, I said to Sally, that the problem is you're only working on the surface of the earth with these behaviors. You're not working down deeper. And she said, "Oh no, Bob, you're wrong. If I get these kids at the right time and do the right kinds of things, I can resculpt their neurons with the things that I'm doing and change those layers." And so it's not just a metabolic kind of change or a biomedical thing. I mean, it is that change, but it also gets changed by our environment, not just pollutants, but by our environment, our caretakers, the kinds of interactions we have, and how then those structures in Middle Earth get formed. And I found it helpful to make my treatment plans based on saying, I'd like to intervene at all those levels. I'd like to intervene at the symptom level if I'm thinking about behavioral things. I'd like to intervene a little further down, maybe if I'm thinking about the family and how they're working together. But I'd like to intervene if there are behaviors that could benefit from medications, or if there are health processes that could benefit from supplements or other things that might make a difference. And I suppose ultimately we could intervene at the genetic level, although I think we're all a little skittish about thinking that we're going to try to change people's genes.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's so interesting, but it sounds so complicated. How would you ever decide in any one particular case where to intervene, where to target some kind of intervention?
Well, I think for years we've talked about the importance of this biopsychosocial model, trying to say, can we look at each of those levels? So it doesn't mean if you're making a Middle Earth intervention, you don't look at the symptoms and think, what could I do based on those symptoms? But it would be, I think of it as a 4-level kind of intervention, or at least 3, maybe not the genetic level, but looking at symptoms and saying, how can I. And the thing that we've been most successful at for autism really has been behaviors, about using interventions that can change people's behaviors. But if we can do testing that, or if we can look at some behaviors that say are like irritability or
anxiety.
Yeah, that those could all be targets for considering at least medications, but there are also some of those things as well, especially based on certain biomarkers that we're increasingly able to use, that we could use supplements that could help people do better. And sometimes it's hard to do that kind of testing. We are increasingly able to do so. And I think our best hope is in what's called metabolomics. So there's a way that we can look at what are thousands of different kinds of processes that clump together into different ways that we can understand it and say, oh, this person really is having a lot of trouble with oxidative stress right now, and that's not working so well. Or this person has a number of inflammatory biomarkers or other things, and then saying, are there interventions that we can use that aren't necessarily heavy duty medications, but might be things that help change it? Like, for instance, we did a study of concentrated broccoli sprout extract that affects oxidative stress. You couldn't eat enough broccoli to be what this concentrated broccoli sprout extract produces, but you can take it in a pill. And the study that we did at Oak Hill School and that others have done at several places around the world suggests that it helps kids improve. Part of our problem is we don't always know, are these kids having trouble with oxidative stress that would make this sphingomyelin or make the broccoli intervention make a difference for these people. And metabolomics may do that. We had an excellent lab that was run by Jill James, who could do a nice assay of oxidative stress. And those kids that had the most oxidative stress showed the most improvement on their concentrated broccoli sprout extract. And those that...
Very suggestive, right? That's suggestive that it helped.
Yeah. And their irritability biomarkers, but several others or behavioral markers showed improvement. But I'd mentioned sphingomyelin is a part of our white matter that showed changes too. I think I don't think we understand it well yet, but I think there's increasing research, and our papers were published in good scientific journals, so people were interested in them. And there are other people doing this too. But I think it's kind of a paradigm shift as we start to say, how can we make the body healthier rather than how can we try to stomp out disease?
It's such an important paradigm shift, and I hear it from a number of different people who are engaged in the science of these neurodevelopmental disorders. It's fascinating to me because as a physician, as a child psychiatrist for so many years, I didn't give much credence to the sort of natural biological factors such as sleep and diet and things like that. I just, there wasn't enough evidence to convince me that they made a difference, even though parents would often be very, very, sure in their own minds that certain kinds of foods and certain kinds of sleep difficulties cause problems in their children. But now I'm beginning to see it in a much different way. And as you've talked about in some of your lectures that I've heard, it doesn't mean that there's a huge effect of one particular one of these factors, but that really you are changing some of that terroir if you change a number of them. And you don't, the problem is, of course, you don't know particularly which ones are the most effective in a particular child, because, as you say, it's very hard to find the biomarkers that can measure them.
Right, that has been the challenge, and metabolomics has been around for a long time, but we still haven't quite perfected it to a way that we could say, okay, these hundreds and thousands of little metabolic byproducts could be put together into clusters and groups that could help us see this profile and say, what this person needs right now is a particular kind of supplement or a particular kind of strengthening of their body's immune or other kinds of things that might make a difference. And the thing that's hard too is that it's not the same always. So a person may be going through a phase, say when they're 6 months old, but they're not going through it at 3, but there's another process that's going on at 3. And we couldn't target the same thing that we did when they were 6 months old at 3 years old because their profile has changed. And how can we better characterize their profile and then better match a kind of intervention with where they're at?
So you're also trying to adapt to or fit into the child's developmental trajectory, the neurobiological, neurodevelopmental trajectory, not just their chronological age even, and certainly not as if it's certainly not the ability to tune in at any particular point with the same intervention. That doesn't make sense, but it does sound so enormously complicated. Of course, development is enormously complicated. We have to accept that.
That's kind of a new thing to think about, though, metabolics. If we were looking at, when can they speak or when can they put together multiple words or all these other measures that we had, now we're trying to look at these internal processes. We did a study of methyl B12, and methyl B12 is something that sometimes you might remember older people would go in for their methyl B12 shot when they were feeling like they needed a little boost of energy. And I think it's kind of worn off. It hasn't been that interesting. But when I first became the executive director at the Mind Institute, the parents, when they were interviewing me to decide whether we were going to do that, and as you might recall, the Mind Institute was founded by parents who raised $100 million, and there were 4 families, 4 fathers that had kids with autism. And when the families interviewed me to see about being the executive director, they said, we want you to leave no stone unturned about what might cause autism and what might be a good treatment for it. We want you to do good science, but we want you to keep an open mind. So after I started, I called together some kind of a little bit alternative medicine people, but people that were trying different things for a meeting, and said, what do you think we should study that, is the first thing that might be a good double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to see, does this really work or not? And the first thing they said they wanted was chelation. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. That's just, it pulls out all kinds of metals. You have to clean the gut first. It's really hard to do a randomized controlled trial. What's next? And they said methyl B12. So as I read about it, it seemed interesting. And this person that I'd mentioned before, Jill James, who does really good biomarkers of oxidative stress, had been doing those studies with methyl B12. And I found another person that had done a fair amount of it, Jim Newbrander, and then we designed a study that got IRB approval, and that we then started having patients come in a randomized controlled trial. And the second kid that came in, I saw him, you give the methyl B12 subcutaneously like a TB shot. You give it every 3 days. And for 2 weeks of that, he came in and he just really seemed different. He looked at me, he wasn't aware of me before. It seemed like he was connecting, he was associating to me. And I said to his parents, do you think he's different? Has he changed? And they both had tears in their eyes, and they said, oh, he's changed so much. We can connect to him in there, to the person that's behind those, what were hazy eyes that didn't focus and didn't connect. That helped him for about 2 years. It didn't keep helping him. It didn't cure his autism. It made a difference, and it got him on the right path. But I think if we could someday begin to understand those processes so that we could keep matching a treatment to their metabolic profile and their behavioral profile and the other things that we know are an important part. And we don't do just one thing at a time. We do everything at all 3 levels, not maybe the genetic, but the 3 levels that we talked about.
Right. No, I think that's such a wonderful dream, and it may very well be achievable. I think sometimes about the families that I see in very low resource communities, especially in low to middle income countries, and I think that I work with as part of the Supporting Child Caregivers nonprofit, and I think, what could we do there? I mean, some of the most promising programs that I've seen have been the social engagement, the sort of community family interventions in which parents are helped to respond to their child on the autism spectrum in a more helpful way. I'm wondering about, if you were to choose one of these interventions that you're just thinking about now, what would you choose as something that you could also offer these low resource communities? Maybe it's maybe it's a silly question, but I'm wondering about it.
Well, I think if the question were broader, like for all people, and most of the alternative medicine, or I don't want to call them that anymore, integrative medicine people start with is methyl B12. A lot of them do that. But the problem, I think, in the community you're talking about is it needs to be refrigerated. It needs to be given sub-Q by somebody that knows how to put this little small needle underneath the skin. And I think that would be
very hard. And especially people would be suspicious of what these doctors were doing in poorly, in unsophisticated communities. But it does make me think more about the possibility of doing more research to allow us to be able to identify the times in a child's development, maybe, when something like methyl B12 would be particularly effective. And then one could imagine referring children in these low resource communities to a specialist center, even if it was hard for them to reach at those particular times. And one could imagine doing that.
I think there are just some vitamins that people could take, like vitamin D seems to show some promise. There are several others that look like they could be helpful. And so I think these kids might benefit from that. If these are kids in areas that have lots of sunshine and they're not protected, they probably don't need vitamin D supplement.
Right. Most of them probably are that. But yeah.
There was an interesting study that first made people think about vitamin D and sunlight that was looking at dark-skinned people who moved to northern climates. And it was a study done in Minnesota, and they had, it seemed that population had a lot more autism, and their vitamin D level was low because they didn't get as much sunlight to get through their dark skin that created a deficiency of vitamin D and then seemed to be associated with autism and autism symptoms.
That's so I think really interesting. Yeah. Well, what about other diet things? Because I've heard more about diet recently, more from the point of view, not so much as an intervention, but as a way of minimizing stress and sort of a sort of general well-being that seemed to be related to some of the symptoms of autism.
Well, I think there has been interest over many years in the casein gluten-free diet, trying to eliminate either or both of those milk or wheat products. And it's been very hard to design a study that shows that it clearly works. I have parents that I have huge respect for that have told me that it's one of the best things that they've done for their kid was to eliminate casein or eliminate gluten. I've had other parents that tell me they tried it religiously for 6 months and it didn't make any difference. But we don't have a good study to look at that. I think if parents are inclined, they might consider trying to eliminate those, especially if they find their child might be sensitive to either of them.
Because an individual child might have sensitivities that are different. Each child might, and so those parents might be completely correct for their particular child. No, I mean, I think these ideas are so important, and it's just very hard to accept the complexity of these biological and developmental processes, not to want to simplify them and cure things when it's really not a question of cure.
Yeah, hopefully we, someday we'll come to the point where we can do a profile of somebody that tells us about the complexities of how all these things interrelate. And we may kind of go, yeah, well, that makes sense. Just like the soil in Alsace-Lorraine makes sense for how people can grow good grapes. But when we then kind of understand it better, then we can better figure out how to make it healthier. And I think that's the part of saying, it's not quite putting fertilizer on it, but it's more like saying, can I help correct these processes that for this child is not growing towards health? Could I help make them healthier rather than, I do a lot of psychopharmacology, giving medications to help modify a kid's behaviors. I don't really like doing that, but it's often the only thing that helps families live in some kind of peace, that they're worried that the child's going to hurt themselves running out into traffic, or that their child's going to hurt another kid, or that their child, they can't go to the grocery store, they can't go to a restaurant. So I use those medications, but I feel like they're this crude instrument of stomping things out rather than helping the body grow in a more healthy way. And I do think that while we may not be able to cure autism, I think we could make it so that it's just a neurodiverse kind of difference. That
exactly. Well, that's what I hope. That's what I hope too. And I do think that if you change the family system by medicating a child to take out some of the unpredictability and threat that the whole family feels, you are changing the terroir. You really are. You're making it possible for the parents to be a different kind of parent, for the child to respond in a different kind of way. So I don't like medication either particularly, but I certainly wouldn't avoid it if I thought it could change a family terroir.
Right. If the kid can now go to school and he couldn't before, well, he can learn social interactions and how to do those things. And if he can go to, or she could go to a restaurant or to a movie or all those kinds of things that they couldn't before, then you've kept them, you've allowed them now to begin to interact with the environment, which is what's so impaired for autism.
That's exactly right. It's also impaired for other neurodevelopmental disorders like what we call ADHD and things like that in a huge way. And often I see children for whom the diagnosis is confused between those two major dimensional developmental disorders or deviations. And it's interesting because the more people become interested in and aware of the diagnosis of autism, the more complicated, the different kinds of presentations we see that are given that diagnosis. So it really is a complex question of terroir. And one of the reasons I like terroir so much as a metaphor is that, of course, you can go just almost across the road, just across the valley, certainly, and have a completely different terroir. And the same is true of the complex picture you describe of a child with a certain set of genes. I think you said in one of the lectures I heard you give that there were more than 600 genes that were associated sometimes with autism. And in one child, you might have a cluster of some of them, but in a sibling, you might have the same cluster without the symptoms of autism. And of course, when you get those symptoms, there's a cascade of developmental, problems, of issues that knock a child off a more typical and in some ways productive developmental trajectory. So it is fascinating and complicated.
Yeah, it is. And it is interesting to think that kids that seem to have almost the same genes some get autism, some don't. So you say, is there something that happened at a certain developmental point that in that way was a kind of trigger, or was the thing that started a cascade of effects that got going? And if you could have identified that earlier, could you have prevented that, and they would have gone through that developmental phase, and then it's over? I think we're a little ways from being there, but I don't think that's not any longer thought of as something that's just a fantasy. That I think people see that we could get there. We're not there yet, but hopefully we can.
Well, another observation I've made, and I think in one of the lectures that I've heard you give, you talked about the fact that often if a family has a child with autism that is significant and enough caused significant impairment, that maybe they wouldn't have another child. But it does seem that, does it seem that there are more first children on the autistic spectrum than second or third children? Is that?
Yeah, it does seem like there are more first in a certain way, but if you have someone who has autism, your risk of having autism goes up. So, and it depends, it seems, from the studies on how far apart were they born. So if they were born closer together, then the risk was greater, suggesting maybe that the genes may come together and some of the environmental factors may be the same affecting them. So, well, in one way, it seems like the first may be more common or more severe. There's a way that because it begins to build up, there seems to be at least some evidence that it continues on. We wrote a paper that we published a couple of years ago about all the factors that seem to be associated with an increased risk of developing autism, perinatal factors, as we call them, factors that were from before birth, before conception, during growth in utero, and then after birth. And then looked at all the studies that also said that by supplementing during that period of time, they could make a difference in the outcome of what happens with autism. And there was some good evidence of things that could be tried. And there have been we did a systematic review of all the studies that had been done, but all of those studies talked about a number of factors. So I think parents that are trying to say, can I think of everything? It doesn't have to be risky kinds of medications, but it's more certain supplements that might improve the odds.
Well, that's really great. I may have that paper, but maybe you could send me the
Sure.
reference and I could put it on the website. That really sounds like an important paper. Is there anything else that you could offer us in terms of what you've been thinking of recently about autism, what you are going to be watching in terms of the research?
Well, I think in talking about younger people or the development of autism, what we've talked about is what has really, is my main interest. But what's really been on my mind lately has been aging and autism. And it appears that we had this tidal wave of autism that started a number of years ago. There's controversy about, well, was it just not recognized and now we're recognizing it, or is there really more of it? I think most studies would suggest that if we're talking about severe autism, that there's still more of it. I think clearly there's more of mild autism, but it may be that we're diagnosing it and we didn't, or others. But when we're talking about hand flapping, no eye contact, little language, severely impaired kids, I just don't think we would have missed them years ago, and that now we're recognizing them. So it does seem like there's more. And as that tidal wave grows and ages, they don't usually age out of autism or get so that they can become self-sufficient. And I worry about how we're going to take care of those kids. They need a place to live. Their families almost always are just committed and feel responsible and do everything they can, but then their parents get old and they die and they can't keep caring for them. There was one study suggesting even that perhaps people with autism have a greater and younger age of Alzheimer's disease or dementia that develops. We don't understand that very well, but I think one of our next big challenges is going to be how to humanely treat people that are aging with the impairments that come with severe autism.
I think you're exactly right. You're exactly right. Wow. Well, that's for younger people than I to puzzle about, but I will be concerned about it too. I want to thank you. Go ahead, please.
I wrote an editorial for the American Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry talking about these kids that fall off the cliff, that when they, depending on the state, reach 22 usually, and they are no longer in the educational system, it's been hard for them to find something, and parents have fought hard in the educational system to get appropriate schooling for the kids, but now they're not in school. And then takes care and helps them grow. And there's some evidence that it's not as quick, but there's still changes that can be made for people as they age, and they can find different kinds of employment or different kinds of skills that they can do and can make their life okay. it's
Well, I appreciate so much you're bringing up this subject, and it reminds me of how respectful and glad I am to hear high quality autism researchers be so caring about the children, so pay so much attention to the human lives that their research is trying to make better, but thinking about the children and their families too, not just the studies that they can publish. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And
Sure.
thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. I know that this will be an episode that many families and also health workers, some of my students, will really be interested in. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate always talking to you, and appreciate the good work you do and helping to spread knowledge far and wide. So,
Okay.
and I hope we run into each other in France someday. So
Well, that would be nice. I think we might be able to arrange it.
that'd be fun.
We have a different terroir.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but good. Okay.
Thank
Great.
you.
Bye.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us in this episode of the Supporting Child Caregivers Podcast. Please join us next week when we will have another episode in our Kids and Autism Spectrum Disorders series. And also remember that I will respond to your questions in my next Ask Me Anything episode. So send me your thoughts and questions at any time to the email sccinc2017@gmail.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Alexandra Harrison, and remember, the children of the world are our future.